1991, spring. The drive from New Jersey to North Carolina takes about 8 hours. Frank Lucas knew every mile of that road, had traveled it dozens of times over the decades, sending money home, visiting his mother, checking on family, making sure the people he'd left behind stayed comfortable. But this drive was different. This was the first time Frank had made it as a free man in 15 years, and he wasn't sure what free meant anymore. He was 60 years old. Prison had aged him in ways mirrors couldn't fully capture. The confidence was still there, somewhere underneath, but it had changed texture, become quieter, less certain of itself. Frank drove alone, didn't want company for this particular journey, knew he needed to face whatever was waiting without an audience. The closer he got to Grange, the more his hands tightened on the steering wheel, because Frank Lucas, who had stared down Italian mob bosses and FBI agents and federal judges, was afraid, not of what he'd find, of what he'd feel when he found it. He arrived at his mother's house at dusk. Mahalee Lucas was 81 years old, still in the house Frank had bought her years ago. Garden still there, roses she'd tended for decades. The porch where she sat in evenings watching the sun set. Frank sat in the car for 10 minutes before going inside. To understand why this return mattered so much, why it broke something in Frank that 15 years of prison had left intact, you need to understand what North Carolina had always meant to him. Not just a place, a definition, the beginning of the story, the wound that never closed. 1930, Grange, population barely 500. Frank was born into the kind of poverty that shapes your entire nervous system before you're old enough to understand what poverty is. His mother cleaned houses. His father picked tobacco, 6 children, 2 rooms, hunger as reliable as the seasons. At 12, Frank watched the Ku Klux Klan tie his cousin to a tree, not to kill him, to remind him he was powerless. That night, lying in that two-room shack listening to his brothers breathe, Frank made a promise he would leave. He would build something. He would never let anyone make him feel that small again. At 15, he left. $40, a bus ticket to New York, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. For the next 45 years, North Carolina was always behind him. The place he came from, the wound he was running from, the reason he needed power so badly that he built an empire to prove he had it. He'd sent money home, built his mother a decent house, helped his brothers and sisters when they needed it, but he'd never really come back, not fully, not to face the place. Prison forced that confrontation, because 15 years of concrete walls and limited movement gives you nothing but time to think. And what Frank thought about in those long prison nights was North Carolina, the beginning, the wound, and now he was here. Mahalee met him at the door, 81 years old, smaller than he remembered, but her eyes still sharp, still seeing through everything he'd built to the boy underneath. She hugged him without speaking, held him for a long time. When she finally let go, she looked at his face the way mothers look when they're reading everything that's happened since the last time they saw. You look tired," she said. "I am tired. Come inside, I made food." They sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen where years ago she touched his chinchilla coat and said 6 words that haunted him. Now there was no coat, just her son, 60 years old, eating chicken and rice and trying to figure out who he was supposed to be. They talked through dinner, about family, about the people she still saw, about who had moved away, who had stayed, who had died. Frank noticed she didn't ask about the prison years, didn't ask about the empire or the trial or the cooperation, just fed him and talked about ordinary things, like she was giving him permission to be ordinary for a few hours. After dinner, Frank said he wanted to walk, take a look at the town. Mahalee nodded, told him to be careful. Frank walked out into a Grange night. The town was small, had always been small. Not much had changed in the 45 years since he'd left. Same streets, same houses, some new buildings, a gas station where there used to be an empty lot, but fundamentally the same place. Time moved differently here than in New York. Frank walked down the main street, nodded at a few people who recognized him. Some nodded back, some looked away. He understood both responses. He turned down a side street, heading nowhere in particular, just walking, feeling the difference between here and where he'd been. And that's when he saw the boy, not a boy really, 20 maybe, sitting on the steps of a house Frank recognized. The Henderson place. He'd known the Henderson family his whole life, 3 generations in Grange, hardworking people. Young man on the steps had the look Frank had learned to recognize over decades. The hollow eyes, the slack posture, the particular quality of stillness that wasn't peace but absence. Frank stopped, stood there for a moment looking at this kid. "You Marcus Henderson's boy?" Frank asked. The young man looked up slowly. "Grandson. Marcus still around?" died in '88. Frank nodded. Marcus Henderson had been a good man, worked the tobacco fields all his life. Had a family, had dignity. Frank stood there looking at his grandson, this kid who was maybe the same age Frank had been when he left this town, but Frank had left with hunger for something better. This kid looked like he had nothing left to be hungry for. "You all right?" Frank asked. The kid looked at him. Something moved in his eyes. Recognition. "Maybe you Frank Lucas." "Yeah." The kid laughed, not happily. "Man, you're famous around here." Frank felt something shift in his stomach. Famous for what? Drug dealer, made millions, the man who got away. "I didn't get away, I did 15 years. Still, you made it out of here, built something." Frank sat down on the steps beside him, something he wouldn't have done 10 years ago, wouldn't have sat on someone's porch steps uninvited. But something about the moment required it. "What's your name?" Darius Henderson." "Yeah, you in school?" Darius looked away. "Nah, working, sometimes." Frank was quiet for a moment, watching the kid. "You using?" Long pause, then sometimes. Something cracked open in Frank's chest, not dramatically, just a slow, quiet fracture, because Frank knew what sometimes meant, had watched sometimes become always in hundreds of men in Harlem, had helped create that progression, had made it efficient, profitable. "What you using?" Frank asked. Darius shrugged. "Whatever's around." "Heroin?" The kid looked at him sideways. "Why you asking?" Frank looked out at the quiet street, Grange at night, 100 miles from Harlem, from the Empire, from Blue Magic. And yet here was Blue Magic's grandchild, not literally, but spiritually. The wave Frank had helped create in New York had traveled, had spread. Rural communities across America had been drowning in opioids for years. The supply chains had shifted, the products had evolved, but the damage was the same. Frank had told himself for years that what happened in Harlem was Harlem's problem, that he was serving an existing demand, that if he hadn't supplied it, someone else would have, that he wasn't responsible for what happened to users because users made their own choices. Sitting next to Darius Henderson on these porch steps in Grange, North Carolina, Frank felt every one of those justifications crumble, because this wasn't abstract, this wasn't a market, this was Marcus Henderson's grandson. A kid whose grandfather Frank had known, a kid who would never know anything but this town, this poverty, this slow destruction. A kid who looked a little like Frank had looked at that age, before Harlem, before the Empire, before the promise that he'd never be powerless. "How'd you end up like this?" Frank asked quietly. Darius shrugged. "Same as everyone, nothing else to do, stuff. Helps with the nothing." "What nothing?" "Just nothing, no jobs, no way out, nothing to look forward to." He paused. "Same nothing you left." Frank felt that sentence land. Same nothing you left. Darius wasn't blaming him, wasn't even making a connection, just describing his reality. But Frank made the connection for both of them. Same nothing, except Frank had run from it, and Darius had surrendered to it. And somewhere in the distance between those two responses, an empire had been built and a generation had been lost. Frank sat there for an hour, talking to Darius, not about drugs or consequences or what he should do differently. Just talking about the town, about his grandfather Marcus, about what Grange used to be and what it had become. When Frank finally stood up to leave, Darius asked him something. "Was it worth it, what you built?" Frank thought about that question for a long time, about the millions he'd made and lost, about the years in prison, about his daughter on the stairs, about his wife leaving, about the names he'd given the FBI, about Bumpy Johnson's lessons, about all of it. "No," Frank said finally. "But I didn't know that until it was too late." "How do you not know something like that?" "Because when you're building it, it feels like the opposite of this." Frank gestured at the street, at the poverty, at the nothing. "It feels like freedom." "Is it?" "For a while, then you figure out it's just a different kind of cage." Frank walked back to his mother's house, sat on her porch, looked at the roses she'd tended for decades, listened to the quiet of a small town at night. He'd left this place at 15 to escape powerlessness, had built an empire to never feel small again, had succeeded in the narrow terms he'd defined success, had made millions, had controlled territory, had defied systems, and then it had all collapsed. Prison, betrayal, loss, 15 years of consequences, and now here he was, back at the beginning, and the beginning looked different from 60 years old than it had from 15. The poverty was still here. The limited options were still here. The nothing that made young men surrender to substances was still here. He hadn't fixed any of it, hadn't changed anything for the people he'd left behind. What he'd done instead was drain something from communities like this one and from Harlem, had built his freedom on the suffering of people who weren't so different from Darius Henderson, who were trapped by the same nothing and who'd found the same terrible comfort. Frank had escaped Grange, but he'd helped recreate it everywhere he went. That thought sat with him on the porch until Mahalee came to tell him his bed was ready. "You all right?" she asked. "I saw Marcus Henderson's grandson tonight." Mahalee was quiet. "Darius, you know about him. I know about most of these kids. There's too many of them. Town's not the same as when you left. What happened?" She sat down beside him. "Same thing that happened everywhere. Jobs left, hope got thin, and something always fills the space where hope used to be." Frank looked at his mother, 81 years old, had lived through everything, had watched her town change, had raised children who went in different directions, had never stopped tending her roses. "I didn't help," Frank said quietly. "What I built, it didn't help places like this." Mahalee was quiet for a long time, then, "No, it didn't. No softening, no reassurance, just the truth, the way she'd always given it." "I don't know how to fix it," Frank said. "Nobody fixes it all at once. You fix what's in front of you." Frank looked at the roses in the darkness. "What's in front of me? Tonight, sleep. Tomorrow, we'll see." He slept in his childhood home for the first time in 45 years. In a room that wasn't a prison cell but still felt unfamiliar, strange, like wearing someone else's clothes. In the morning, Frank drove through Grange again, with different eyes than the night before, seeing it as it was, not as the place he'd fled from or the place he'd romanticized in prison. He stopped at a youth center on the edge of town, not because he had a plan, just because Darius Henderson's face was still in his mind. He walked in, found the director, a woman in her 40s named Patricia Simmons who'd grown up in Grange and come back to build something. "I'm Frank Lucas," he said. Patricia Simmons looked at him. "I know who you are. I'd like to help. If you need anything, money, whatever's useful." Patricia studied him for a long moment. Why? Frank didn't have a neat answer, couldn't explain about Darius Henderson or the porch steps or the thing that had cracked open in his chest the night before. Couldn't explain 45 years of running and 15 years in prison and 60 years of trying to be powerful enough that nothing could hurt him. "Because I owe something," Frank said finally, "to this town, to people like these kids." Patricia Simmons looked at him for another long moment, then she nodded. "We could use funding for the after-school program and someone to talk to the older boys, someone they might actually listen to." Frank nodded. "I can do that." He stayed in Grange for 3 weeks, longer than he'd planned, spent time at the youth center, talked to kids, not about his empire, about the nothing, about what it meant. About the difference between running from it and surrendering to it. He never saw Darius Henderson again during that visit. Asked around. Was told Darius had gone to stay with relatives somewhere. Frank hoped that was true. When Frank finally drove back to New Jersey, he understood something he hadn't when he'd arrived. Prison had given him time, had punished him professionally, had taken his freedom and his money and his reputation. But it hadn't broken him, not really, because prison was external. It was something done to him, and things done to you even for 15 years don't reach the deepest parts of who you are. North Carolina had broken him. The return to the beginning, the recognition that he hadn't escaped his origins by building an empire, had just exported them. Had just created more Granges in different zip codes. Darius Henderson had done what no FBI agent, no federal judge, no prison sentence had managed. He made Frank Lucas understand at 60 years old what he'd actually built. Not an empire, not power, just more of the same nothing, with better distribution. Frank continued donating to the Grange Youth Center until he died. Patricia Simmons never became his friend exactly, but she took his money and used it. And sometimes that's what accountability looks like. Not dramatic transformation, just money going where it should have gone decades earlier. Mahalee Lucas died in 1995. Frank was at her bedside, held her hand, told her he was sorry for everything that needed apologizing for. She told him she loved him, that she'd always loved him. And that love didn't mean she hadn't seen exactly what he was. Frank knew that, had always known that. It was the thing about his mother that he'd never been able to outrun. She saw him, all of him. The frightened 12-year-old who watched his cousin tied to a tree. The ambitious 15-year-old who left with $40. The powerful 40-year-old in the chinchilla coat. The broken 60-year-old sitting on her porch. She saw all of it and loved him anyway, and refused to lie to him about any of it. That was the real North Carolina, not the poverty or the nothing or even Darius Henderson's hollow eyes, but his mother who spent 81 years seeing her son clearly and loving him without illusion. Frank carried that home with him, carried Grange with him for the rest of his life. not as something to run from, finally, after 60 years, as something to understand. He never escaped where he came from. Nobody does. You carry it with you. The question is what you do with it. Frank Lucas spent the last 30 years of his life trying to do something useful with what he carried. It wasn't enough, couldn't be enough. Some things can't be repaid, but he tried, and that was different from anything he'd done before. That was what North Carolina gave him in the end. Not forgiveness, not redemption, just the chance to try. And for a man who'd spent his whole life running, trying was its own kind of homecoming.